David stepped off the bus, his excitement growing as he looked around the bustling city. He had been planning this trip for months, dreaming about the food, the sights, and the experiences waiting for him. This was his first time visiting the city, and he was eager to dive into the culture. He grabbed his camera, checked his guidebook, and decided to stop at one of the most popular local restaurants for breakfast. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm golden glow across the streets. The restaurant he chose was charming, with an outdoor seating area decorated with colorful plants and string lights. It had a reputation for serving delicious local dishes, and David was looking forward to trying something new. He felt a sense of adventure, ready to immerse himself in the local flavors and start his day off right. As he stepped inside, the warm smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling eggs filled the air. The place was buzzing with activity, with a few people chatting quietly over their meals. David took a deep breath, enjoying the comforting scent. He approached the counter and smiled at the waitress behind the register. "Hi. I'd like a table for one, please," David said, his voice friendly and upbeat. The waitress, a woman in her mid-30s, looked up from the register. She gave him a cue. David stood there, waiting for the manager to arrive, his heart still racing from the harsh words the waitress had thrown at him. He was shaking slightly, not from fear but from the anger that was building inside him. It was hard to believe that someone could speak like that to another person, especially in a public place. He had never imagined something like this would happen to him, not here, not in this restaurant that was supposed to offer a welcoming environment. The restaurant was eerily quiet, the once lively hum of conversation now replaced by the uncomfortable sound of silverware clinking against plates. The other patrons were all staring, some in shock, others in disbelief, but no one spoke. David glanced around, feeling the weight of their silence. Was anyone going to step up? Was anyone going to defend him, or would they all just watch in silence as he was humiliated? The door to the back kitchen opened, and a man stepped out. He was dressed in a black polo shirt with a logo embroidered on the chest, the restaurant's name. He had the look of someone who was used to managing busy shifts, his expression a mix of concern and confusion. He stopped in his tracks when he saw David standing by the counter, looking visibly upset. "Sir, what's the problem?" the manager asked, his voice cautious. His eyes flicked nervously toward the waitress who was still standing by the register, her arms crossed as if she were daring anyone to question her. David took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. "I was just sitting here, minding my own business, ordering breakfast. But then this waitress," he paused, struggling to keep his emotions in check, "she told me to go back to Africa. I don't know why she said that, but it's wrong. And it's not right that I should be treated like this." The manager blinked, stunned. "What? She said that to you?" His voice was low, disbelieving, as if he couldn't quite process the words. He turned to look at the waitress, who shrugged with an almost dismissive gesture. David's frustration boiled over. "Yes, she said it. And I want to know why. Why would she say something so hurtful, especially to someone she doesn't even know?" The manager looked between David and the waitress, his face growing red with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, sir. That's completely unacceptable. Please, let me take care of this." David watched as the manager walked over to the waitress, his voice growing louder as he began to speak in a firm tone. "This is not how we treat customers here. I don't care what's going on with you, but this kind of behavior will not be tolerated." The waitress stood there, her arms still crossed, her expression unbothered. "I didn't say anything wrong," she muttered, her eyes shifting toward the floor as if she didn't want to make eye contact with anyone. David felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. How could she act so unaffected by the situation? How could she be so indifferent to the harm her words had caused? It didn't make sense. He had expected an apology, maybe some remorse, but instead, she acted like it was no big deal. "I'm sorry, sir," the manager said again, this time with more conviction. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." He turned back to David, his face apologetic. "This is not the kind of behavior we want in our establishment. We take pride in treating every customer with respect, and we can't allow this kind of treatment to continue." David nodded, still trying to process everything. "I don't want to make this a bigger issue. I just want an apology. An acknowledgement that what was said was wrong." But the waitress didn't apologize. Instead, she simply rolled her eyes and muttered under her breath. David could barely hear her, but he caught a glimpse of her lips forming words that sounded like whatever. The manager, clearly fed up with the situation, turned back to David. "I'm going to take care of this right now." He then walked over to the counter, where the waitress was still standing, and spoke to her in a stern tone that left no room for argument. David didn't hear all the words, but he could tell that the manager was serious. She didn't protest, and moments later, she stormed out of the restaurant, slamming the door behind her. David was left standing there, his heart still racing, but now, there was a sense of relief. The situation was far from over, but at least the immediate conflict had been resolved. He felt his anger slowly start to ebb away as the manager returned to his side, apologizing again. "I'm so sorry, sir," the manager said, his face apologetic. "This isn't how we operate, and it's a reflection of poor judgment on our part. You have every right to be upset, and I understand why you're angry. Please know that we take this matter very seriously, and we're going to address it with the proper authorities." David nodded, his thoughts still spinning. He appreciated the manager's apology, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper needed to be done. This wasn't just about a rude waitress, it was about the larger issue of racism and how people, particularly people of color, are often treated with suspicion or hostility, even in everyday settings like restaurants. As David stood there, lost in thought, the sound of a phone camera snapping brought him back to the present. He turned to see a couple sitting at the next table, their phones out, recording the scene. He didn't know what to think. Part of him felt exposed, vulnerable, but another part of him appreciated that someone was capturing the moment. Maybe, just maybe, this could spark a conversation that would lead to change. One of the customers, a middle-aged man, stood up and approached David. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," he said sincerely. "That's not right. No one should ever be treated like that." David forced a smile. "Thank you. It's not easy, but I appreciate the support." The man nodded. "It's a shame that these things still happen in this day and age. I'm glad you stood up for yourself." David didn't know how to respond. He wasn't looking for praise, he just wanted the injustice to stop. He was tired of the constant, silent discrimination, the microaggressions that people like him faced on a daily basis. It wasn't just about what had happened in the restaurant, it was about the larger culture that allowed these things to happen in the first place. The man shook David's hand and returned to his seat. As he sat down, the other customers around the room began murmuring to each other. Some nodded in agreement, others sighed, but all of them seemed to understand the weight of what had just happened. David's eyes scanned the room one more time, and this time, he felt a sense of solidarity, a quiet but powerful understanding. He wasn't alone in this. As the manager returned to the counter, David took a deep breath and decided to leave. It was clear that the situation had been resolved for the most part, but David didn't want to stay in a place that had been tainted by such a hurtful experience. He gathered his things and stood up, ready to move on. He didn't know where he was going next, but he knew he couldn't let this moment define his entire trip. As he walked out of the restaurant, he felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, anger, frustration, and even a bit of hope. Maybe this story wasn't over. Maybe it was just the beginning. David stepped out of the restaurant, the morning air cool against his skin. His mind was still racing, thoughts spinning from the confrontation he had just experienced. As he walked down the street, he found it difficult to shake the sting of the words the waitress had thrown at him. Go back to Africa. He had never expected to hear something like that in a place he thought was welcoming. He had imagined this vacation would be an escape, a time to relax, enjoy new experiences, and immerse himself in the beauty of a different culture. Instead, it had quickly turned into something else, something far more painful. But as he walked, his anger slowly began to fade, replaced by a sense of clarity. He didn't want this to ruin his day. He didn't want it to ruin his whole trip. David had always believed in the power of resilience, the ability to rise above the negativity that people sometimes throw at you. He wasn't going to let this moment define him. As he walked down the street, the city's energy began to work its magic. People were bustling around, heading to work, grabbing coffee, or enjoying the early morning sunshine. The street was lined with charming little cafes, colorful boutiques, and street vendors selling handmade goods. It was a place that felt alive, vibrant, and full of possibility. David knew he couldn't let one person's words ruin his experience of the city. He made his way to a nearby park, where he sat down on a bench to clear his mind. He took a deep breath and tried to focus on the present moment. The sun was rising higher now, and the park was beginning to fill with people. Families walked by, children played, and a couple sat on the grass, holding hands. For a moment, David was able to relax. The peaceful surroundings offered a brief escape from the storm of emotions that had been swirling inside him just an hour before. But as he sat there, a thought began to take root in his mind. This wasn't just about him. This wasn't just about one racist incident in a restaurant. It was part of something much bigger. It was a reflection of the deep-rooted prejudice that still existed in society. The kind of prejudice that people like the waitress carried with them, whether they realized it or not. It was about the everyday racism that people of color faced, the microaggressions, the judgment, the stares. The fact that someone like David, just a man sitting down for a meal, could be treated that way was a symptom of something far more harmful. David knew that silence wouldn't fix this problem. He couldn't just ignore it and move on, hoping it would disappear. He had to speak up, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been made to feel less than because of their skin color. He had to make sure that what happened to him wasn't forgotten, that it didn't just slip through the cracks. He wasn't going to let it be swept under the rug. But what could he do? He wasn't sure, but he knew he had to do something. And as he sat there, pondering his next move, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from a friend back home. David opened it, reading the words, "Hey man, how's the trip going? Are you having fun?" For a moment, David felt a wave of sadness. He wanted to tell his friend about all the amazing things he'd seen so far, the beautiful places he'd visited, and the exciting adventures he'd had. But instead, he found himself typing something entirely different. "You won't believe what just happened to me. I was at a restaurant, and a waitress told me to go back to Africa. I was shocked. I don't know what to do." He stared at the message for a moment before sending it. As the words left his phone and into the world, a strange feeling washed over him. He had just shared something so personal, something so painful. But in a way, it felt like a weight had been lifted. By telling his friend, by opening up about what had happened, he was taking a small step toward confronting the injustice. As he sat there, his phone buzzed again. His friend's reply came through quickly, "What? That's messed up, man. You need to report her. You can't just let that slide. People like that need to be held accountable." David's heart skipped a beat. His friend was right. He couldn't just let it go. If he did, nothing would change. The waitress would never understand the harm she'd caused. She wouldn't learn. And more people would continue to face the same type of treatment. David stood up from the bench, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't just about making a report, it was about speaking out, raising his voice, and using this experience to fight for something bigger. He wasn't going to be silent. He wasn't going to let this moment pass without doing something. He made his way to the nearest cafe, pulled out his laptop, and started researching how to file a formal complaint. He looked up the restaurant's website, found the contact information for customer service, and began drafting an email. He wrote about what had happened, explaining the incident in clear, concise terms. He didn't want to make this about anger, he wanted it to be about accountability. He wanted the restaurant to understand that words like those could cause real harm, even if they were said casually. As he typed, David felt a sense of determination growing inside him. This wasn't just about getting the waitress fired, though that was part of it. It was about creating awareness, starting a conversation, and making sure that people knew this kind of behavior was unacceptable. He wanted the restaurant to understand the impact of her words, to see how deep the wounds of racism went, and to realize the role they played in either perpetuating or stopping it. He finished the email, reviewed it, and hit send. There was a moment of silence before he closed his laptop. The feeling of finality was strange. It was as though he had taken the first step in a long journey. A journey that he wasn't sure where it would lead, but one that he knew he had to take. David left the cafe and walked back to his hotel, his heart feeling lighter. It wasn't over, but he had done something. He had taken control of the situation, and now it was in the hands of the restaurant. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew that he had done the right thing. That evening, as David lay in bed, he found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. The shock, the anger, the confusion, those emotions were still there, but they had been replaced by something stronger. A sense of purpose. A feeling that this wasn't just an isolated incident, it was part of a bigger picture. And David knew that he was going to continue fighting for change, no matter how small the steps seemed. It was just the beginning. The next few days passed in a blur for David. He had spent the last several hours exploring the city, trying to push the incident from his mind. The beautiful architecture, the friendly people, and the fascinating history of the place had helped distract him, but the weight of the experience still lingered in his heart. It wasn't something he could just forget, no matter how hard he tried. David continued to receive messages from friends back home, offering their support and asking how he was doing. He appreciated their concern, but part of him wanted to move past it. He didn't want to be known as the guy who had been disrespected in a restaurant. He wanted to be seen for his character, his curiosity about the world, and his passion for travel. But deep down, he knew this moment wasn't just about him, it was part of a much larger issue. His phone buzzed late one afternoon as he sat in a cafe, sipping on a cappuccino. He glanced at the screen and saw an email from the restaurant he had visited a few days earlier. His heart skipped a beat as he clicked it open. "Dear Mr. David," the email began, "we are writing to acknowledge the complaint you submitted regarding the unfortunate incident you experienced with one of our employees. We take such matters very seriously, and we deeply regret that you had to endure such behavior while visiting our restaurant. Please be assured that we have launched a full investigation into the situation and are taking the necessary steps to address it." David read the rest of the email carefully, his fingers tightening around his cup. The restaurant promised that the waitress involved would be held accountable, and they assured him that the incident would be used as a learning opportunity for their staff. The email concluded with an apology and an invitation for David to return, offering him a complimentary meal as a gesture of goodwill. For a moment, David just stared at the screen. The apology felt genuine, but he wasn't sure if it was enough. The waitress had been disrespectful, and while an apology was nice, it didn't take away the sting of what had happened. Still, he appreciated that the restaurant had taken his complaint seriously. It was a step forward. David took a deep breath and typed a reply, thanking them for their response but also expressing his hope that the restaurant would do more than just address the issue on an individual level. He suggested that they implement a diversity and inclusion training program for all staff members, to prevent similar situations from happening in the future. He didn't want this to be just a one-off incident that was quickly forgotten. He wanted it to spark real change. After sending the email, David leaned back in his chair and looked out the window. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city. It felt like the perfect moment for reflection. He had made his voice heard, and he had done something to stand up for what was right. But he knew that there was still more to be done. The incident wasn't just about him, it was about creating awareness, having uncomfortable conversations, and ultimately, working toward a world where everyone was treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their skin color. The next day, as David was walking through a park, he ran into the middle-aged man who had spoken to him in the restaurant a few days earlier. The man smiled as he saw David and approached him. "Hey, how are you doing?" the man asked. "I just wanted to check in and see if everything was okay after, the incident." David returned the smile, grateful for the man's kindness. "I'm doing better. I've been trying to focus on enjoying the trip, but it's been hard to forget what happened." The man nodded sympathetically. "I understand. That kind of thing sticks with you, doesn't it? It's not just the words that hurt, it's the way it makes you feel. Like you don't belong. I know it can be tough, but I really admire how you handled it." David felt a lump form in his throat. The man's words resonated with him more than he had expected. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure how to react at first, but I knew I couldn't just stay quiet." The man put a hand on David's shoulder. "You did the right thing. Sometimes, standing up to hate is the hardest thing to do, but it's also the most important. You've got to be the change you want to see in the world, right?" David nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude toward this stranger who had shown him so much kindness. "Yeah," he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I guess you're right." As the man walked away, David couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. He had taken the first step, but he knew that this was only the beginning. Standing up against racism wasn't something that could be solved with a single complaint or one email. It was a lifelong journey. It required constant awareness, education, and most importantly, action. Later that day, David received a follow-up email from the restaurant. This time, it was from the general manager. They thanked him for his feedback and shared that they had already begun the process of training their staff in diversity, inclusion, and cultural sensitivity. The manager also mentioned that the waitress in question had been given a formal warning, and that they were committed to ensuring that all their employees treated every customer with respect, regardless of their background. David was relieved to hear that the restaurant was taking concrete steps to make a difference. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was progress. He felt a sense of hope that, through his actions, others would be able to avoid experiencing what he had gone through. As the days went by, David continued to explore the city. He visited museums, walked through historical landmarks, and met new people. Each day brought something new, and he began to realize that, despite the negative experience, the trip was still shaping up to be an incredible adventure. The more David reflected on what had happened, the more he understood how deeply rooted racism was in society. It wasn't just about one encounter in a restaurant, it was a pattern, a cycle that needed to be broken. He had taken action, but he knew that true change required collective effort. It wasn't just about one person speaking up, it was about everyone joining together to create a world where kindness and respect were the standard, not the exception. David had made a decision. He wasn't going to let this incident define him. He wasn't going to let it sour his experience or make him feel like an outsider. Instead, he would carry the lessons he had learned with him, using his voice to fight for what was right, no matter where he went or who he encountered. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but he was ready to walk it. As the days passed, David's thoughts often returned to the incident at the restaurant. It hadn't been easy to move on from, but as he continued his travels through the city, he found himself focusing more on the beauty around him and the kindness of the people he met. His vacation was far from ruined. In fact, it had turned into something far more significant, an opportunity for growth, reflection, and making a difference. One morning, as he was walking through a busy market square, David bumped into a woman who had been sitting nearby when the incident occurred in the restaurant. She smiled warmly at him, her eyes full of kindness. "I just wanted to check in," she said. "I saw what happened, and I wanted to say that I admire how you handled everything. Not everyone would have had the courage to speak up like that." David was taken aback by her words, grateful for her kindness. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "It wasn't easy. Honestly, I wasn't sure how to react at first, but I knew I had to do something. I couldn't let it slide." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You know, sometimes people don't realize the impact of their words. They think it's just a passing comment, but it can affect someone for a lifetime. What you did, it mattered. You gave a voice to something that so many people feel but are afraid to say." David smiled, feeling a warmth inside him. It wasn't often that he received this kind of support from a stranger. "I appreciate that," he said. "It's been a tough experience, but I've learned a lot from it. I think the most important thing is to keep pushing for change, no matter how hard it is." The woman smiled again, her eyes filled with understanding. "You're right. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with people like you, speaking out and demanding better. We all have a part to play in making the world a better place." As they parted ways, David felt a renewed sense of hope. Maybe this whole experience had been a wake-up call, not just for him but for others as well. People needed to understand that these kinds of hurtful actions, whether intentional or not, needed to be addressed. If no one spoke up, if everyone just remained silent, nothing would ever change. Later that afternoon, David returned to his hotel room and checked his email. He had been anxiously awaiting a response from the restaurant, and today, he finally received one. The email was from the general manager, and as David read through it, he couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. "Dear Mr. David," the email began, "we are writing to follow up on your recent experience at our restaurant. We would like to extend our sincerest apologies again for the behavior you experienced. We want to reassure you that we are taking your feedback very seriously. In addition to the disciplinary actions already taken, we have scheduled a company-wide training on cultural sensitivity and inclusivity. We are committed to ensuring that every guest, regardless of background, feels welcome in our establishment. Thank you again for bringing this to our attention, and we hope to have the opportunity to serve you again in the future." David couldn't help but smile as he read the email. He had hoped for a response like this, but seeing it in writing made it real. The restaurant was taking steps to address the issue, and he had played a part in making that happen. It wasn't about revenge or anger, it was about progress. It was about creating an environment where people didn't have to fear being treated differently simply because of the color of their skin. As he sat back in his chair, David felt a sense of pride. He had used his voice to make a difference, and now, the restaurant was taking action. But he also knew that this was just one small victory in a much larger battle. Racism, discrimination, and prejudice were still pervasive in society, and there was still much work to be done. David knew that the journey didn't end with one email, one conversation, or one apology. It was an ongoing process. The real change would come from continued conversations, from standing up in every situation, big or small, and from demanding better not just from businesses, but from each other as human beings. The following day, David decided to visit a local museum. As he walked through the exhibits, he found himself thinking about the conversations he had had with strangers in the past few days. People were more willing to talk about racism, inequality, and injustice than ever before. They were willing to listen, to acknowledge that things needed to change, and to do their part in making that happen. David had never felt more encouraged by the willingness of others to join the fight for fairness. As he stood in front of a painting, his mind wandered back to the incident in the restaurant. It had been such a brief moment in time, yet it had left an indelible mark on his soul. He realized that sometimes, change didn't come in the form of grand gestures. Sometimes, it came from small, everyday actions. It came from a simple decision to speak up, to challenge harmful behavior, and to hold people accountable. David had never felt more connected to the idea of creating positive change. His trip had started as an escape, but it had turned into something more, a chance to make a difference, even in small ways. He had learned that standing up for what was right wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about making progress, no matter how small. Later that night, David sat down at a cafe, his laptop open in front of him. He drafted another email to the restaurant, this time thanking them for their response and suggesting that they consider creating a community outreach program. He knew that real change needed to extend beyond the walls of the restaurant. It needed to reach the community, to encourage people to have open conversations about race, respect, and kindness. As he finished typing, David felt a sense of accomplishment. He had come a long way since that uncomfortable moment in the restaurant. He had faced the harsh words of a stranger, stood his ground, and used the experience to spark change. And even though he had more work to do, he was proud of what he had accomplished. The next morning, David received a response from the restaurant's general manager, thanking him for his continued feedback. The manager assured David that they were taking his suggestions seriously and would be looking into ways to engage with the community moving forward. David smiled as he closed his laptop. He felt good knowing that his actions had led to positive change. The experience had shown him that one person really could make a difference, even when it seemed like the odds were stacked against them. As he walked through the city that morning, David felt a sense of peace. He had used his voice for good, and that was all he could ask for. He had learned that change wasn't always easy, but it was always possible. And that, above all, was the lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life.